This presentation is entitled The Pandemic and Universal Basic Income. My name is Malcolm Ferry. Please do follow me along on Twitter at Malcolm Ferry, and I sincerely hope that you enjoy this presentation. So I live on the small island of Jersey, which is an archipelago in the English Channel, of which Jersey is the largest. There are others, Guernsey, Alderney and Sark, and some other small islands in that group. But Jersey is the largest, albeit still very small. It is 9 by 5 miles and has a population of around 108,000. Obviously that in normal times expands in the summer as people come over on holiday and people come over to work temporarily. So the economy is very vibrant. The population is extremely diverse. We have a large influx of immigrant workers over the summer season, and they come from places such as Eastern Europe. We still get lots of people who come over from Poland and France and Portugal, lots of other European countries. So that makes for a nice blend of people who live here permanently, people who have come over and made Jersey their home, and people who are here for a relatively short period of time. So we are a self-governing Crown dependency, and our main industries are finance, tourism and agriculture. Our GDP in 2019 was £4,885 million, and finance, of course, makes up for a large amount of that sum because we are still a vibrant finance centre. Tourism in normal times was kind of on the wane, but generally speaking, throughout the pandemic, we've done reasonably well because we are part of the European, the common travel area. And so people can get to and from Jersey from the UK and the Isle of Man and other places that are in the common travel area reasonably easy. There are very few restrictions coming into the island, particularly of late, where all that's required at the borders is a PCR test, a lateral flow test, which obviously is delivered fairly quickly and at the moment at no cost. Agriculture, traditionally, people probably think of Jersey as the Jersey cow and Jersey potatoes. And whilst those two industries within the agricultural industry are still prevalent on the island, they are not what they were even 10 or 20 years ago. But the local potatoes are still grown, particularly in the spring, and I think lots of people associate the early summer months with that crop of Jersey Royals. So there are restrictions on who can come to live in Jersey, and it's primarily controlled through our housing and work legislation. So not everyone can just come to the island and live and work in any accommodation or in any job. There is basically a break point of 5-year residency. So there are certain jobs that can only accommodate someone who's been here for 5 years, and there are lots of restrictions on where people can actually live. So a little bit about my background and my interests. I've lived in Jersey all my life. I started my working life in the finance industry, as lots of people in Jersey do. I was advising clients on investments, pensions and life insurance. After that, I moved to the civil service, where I worked for the Social Security Department, and I had responsibilities for fraud, that's benefit fraud, and compliance with Social Security legislation. So I took up a position as CEO of Citizens Advice Jersey in November 2010, and I've more recently moved to become the CEO of Headway Jersey, which is a local brain injury charity. So my interest in universal basic income stems from seeing the benefit system from both sides of the equation. So when I was at the Social Security Department, I would regularly investigate and prosecute people who had fraudulently obtained benefit. And I would also see people to advise on the range of benefits that were available to them. And of course, when I went to Citizens Advice, I saw people who needed benefits advice again, or who had been contacted by the Social Security Department because they had fraudulently obtained benefits. So some people kind of saw my role as poacher turned gamekeeper. I think the reality is what I tried to do is be as impartial as possible and be as fair and unbiased as possible in any advice that I gave whilst I was the CEO of Citizens Advice Jersey. But my reading about universal basic income comes from the shortfalls in the benefit system, the reasons that people fraudulently obtain benefit, the cost to the taxpayer of administering benefit, let alone making sure that people are getting the right amount of benefit, and the restrictions that are in place. I'm sure that anyone who's got any interest in universal basic income understands the concept of a floor and ceiling benefit. We have a system of income support, which is very similar to the universal credit system that you have in the UK. And lots of people understand that having a floor and ceiling benefit can hold people back as much as it brings people forward and benefits them by getting them back into the workplace. So when I was a fraud inspector, I liaised regularly with the income support department, and I got to completely understand why people resent being pushed into jobs that they don't particularly want, and what they do to avoid that. And also I came to understand the reasons that people manipulate the system to their own ends, or in extreme circumstances, fraudulently obtain benefit in a way of topping up their income. Sometimes that I saw that as through necessity rather than perhaps through greed, as most people would perhaps cubbyhole it. But my understanding of the benefit system and the people who claim benefit, and the way that it is a positive thing for society, was that, you know, our benefit system in Jersey, particularly our income support system, is still relatively new. It came into force in 2009, and so we are still in the sort of relatively early evolution of that system. And what I found is, you know, there are much slicker, smoother, inexpensive ways of getting money to people, and of course universal basic income is one of those ways. So if we talk about the shifting sands and COVID-19 in particular, so because I had worked for the government when COVID-19 sprung up in Jersey, which was in March 2020, I was seconded to form a community task force to make sure that vulnerable people in particular had everything that they needed in life as regards the basics. And so I worked with government agencies, and I worked with third sector organisations, and I worked with philanthropists to make sure that all those structures were in place, that were very accessible for people, and that people understood exactly how to access those support systems. So one of the first things that I did was I set up a system of digital vouchers and electricity vouchers. So we were really concerned during our first lockdown that people who were perhaps on the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum would be cut off from the internet, or would lose connectivity to the electricity supply. And although our telco providers and our one electricity provider gave all sorts of assurances that that wouldn't happen during lockdown, we of course were concerned that people would come out of lockdown with big debts to both of those utilities. So what we set up in place was a system whereby people could claim a digital voucher to pay for their internet connectivity, and a system where people who went to food banks, if they needed it, they were given an electricity top-up voucher, again to make sure that they never lost access to the electricity supply. Also, as part of my work, believe it or not, people think of Jersey as being an island of rich people, and to some extent, of course, that is true. But there is quite a big divide in terms of haves and have-nots, and there are food banks on the island, and there have been for a number of years. But most of those food banks were staffed by people who had to start shielding. So I was really keen to make sure that the food bank provision was centralised as quickly as possible. There was one access point for people to get food who needed it, and one distribution point to get food out into people's homes if they needed to access it that way. I had been involved in some of the Brexit planning in the islands, particularly in terms of day one no deal scenario, which we were concerned about, and actually centralising the food banks was very much part of our planning. So when COVID-19 came along, some of that planning really paid dividends. It wasn't exactly the scenario that we were concerned about, but a lot of the preparation that we put in place made it clear that the exact things that we feared that would happen in a day one no deal Brexit scenario actually happened through the COVID-19 scenario, just in a slightly different manner. At that time, I was also contacted by lots of philanthropists who would literally phone me up and say, I've got X amount of money. If you can tell me how that's going to benefit people in our community that need it, I will get it to you within the next couple of days. So I had offers of sometimes quite large sums of money, which I was able to direct either to the electricity or the digital vouchers, or I was able to access and direct to the food bank provision to make sure that they were well stocked with funds, and therefore, as a byproduct, be well stocked with food. I also took part in lots of press conferences and media interviews in particular to relay that information to people, to tell them that the support was available, how to access that support, and basically to offer reassurance that no one was going to be left behind in this pandemic. I think, like lots of jurisdictions, as I mentioned earlier, we have quite tight controls on who can access accommodation and who can access work in Jersey. And one of the things which is very clear from our benefit system is unless you've been here for 5 years, as a general principle, you will not get access to the income support system. Now, what we put in place, or what was put in place by the government in really short order, was a way to make sure that even if people didn't qualify for income support, they would be able to get payments through what was called a CRESS scheme, which was a coronavirus response emergency support payments. And that was to make sure that at least people had a sum of money each week, to make sure that they didn't go without. You know, that was unprecedented for Jersey, because one thing which has always been one of our government's red lines is that only people who've been here for 5 years can have access to the benefit system. So that was a big win. I think what we saw during the pandemic, particularly in Jersey, and I'm sure this has happened in lots of other jurisdictions, is a fantastic collaboration between the third sector and government. So we saw voluntary services really working together with the support of government. We've got a really powerful parochial system set up in Jersey. There are 12 parishes headed up by 12 constables, and each of those parishes wanted to be involved, wanted to help their own constituents, and wanted to help the wider community. So that whole time during our first lockdown, which actually for us only lasted about 2 months, so much fantastic work was done, and so much will and ability to work together to achieve something fantastic was born out of the pandemic. Another thing that came along kind of just after that first lockdown was one thing that the government was really interested in doing was to reinvigorate the economy, to make people feel good, and also to obviously, you know, get people back out into the shops and get people back out socializing and spending, always of course tempered with the realities of continuing to spread the virus. And of course there was something similar in the UK with the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. But the way that we approached it in Jersey was £100 was paid to all islanders. So it was a universal payment on a prepaid card, which was a twinning with MasterCard. Money could only be spent electronically. So one was sent to every address in the island, which equated to around £11 million of fiscal stimulus. I think the benefits of having it as a trackable card, and of course there is a very robust data sharing agreement with MasterCard, so they won't necessarily give the government all the information that they have on the spend, but it is really interesting to be able to segment where that money was spent, and it can be split by age demographic and all those sorts of things. So it was activated online or over the telephone. Very simple process, just with a telephone number and a PIN number, and then away you went. The first time you made a payment, if you were not going to spend it all at once, you had to do it with a physical PIN code. Once you'd made a first payment, if there was more money still left on the card, you could do it with contactless by just tapping on the machine. So a great way for people to just get out, spend a bit of money in a cafe or go out for a nice meal. And the instructions from the government was treat yourself. So they really wanted it to be a feel-good factor behind this. So there was an 8-week time frame on which to spend this universal payment. And I think, of course, what that did was made sure that that money did get back out into the economy. There was really robust restrictions for use. So whilst you could spend it on the internet, that had to track back to a Jersey company. So you could not buy an Amazon product with it, for want of a better word. Of course, other internet providers are available. But it was a local businesses only. In fact, to the point where they could actually tune in and tune out what you could spend it on. So one of the restrictions was you could not spend it on gambling. So if you want to put your whole £100 on the 230 at Ascot, and you try to pay through one of our local bookies, it wouldn't accept that payment. And from that, for me, was a really interesting dynamic, because I started to get to thinking, if they'd have really wanted to fine tune it, they could have prevented people from spending it in pubs, or prevented people from spending it on certain other products. Now, one of the arguments at the time, of course, was we don't care broadly, the government doesn't care where you spend it on. Spend it and treat yourself, enjoy it. Of course, if you spend it in a pub, you're still putting money into the local economy, or you might be helping a local brewery, whether that's a small brewery or a micro brewery or a bigger affair. So it was a great way to get money into the economy in short order, made people feel really good, made people feel that the government cared about them, generally speaking. And when you look at the way that the split is starting to come through now, with dissecting the way that spend played out, about £1.57 million of that £11 million went into the hospitality sector, which of course was devastated in the early part of the pandemic. People weren't coming over, hotels weren't filling up, and of course people weren't going out for lunches or meals because they had the stay-at-home order. So it did manage to get money back into local businesses, and particularly into the hospitality sector, fairly swiftly. So very powerful way to stimulate the economy, pay it as a universal payment. And of course, if there's a good exercise in how putting money in people's pockets plays out into the economy, particularly if it's time bound on the spend, I think that the Spend Local card is a really good example of that. I know that other jurisdictions are now looking at doing a similar thing, not least Northern Ireland, who's going to do £100 spend in a slightly different way, is my understanding. It's not done through an electronic card, but they are still getting monies out to the local population in a very similar way to the way that we did it. The difference, of course, is I think tracking it is going to be a lot harder than it was through a tie-up with MasterCard, because all of that data of that money that was ever spent is still available to be looked at and analysed. There was some hope that because the instructions were keep hold of the card in case it gets recharged again. And I think when they made the first payment, the government made the first payment, there was a pretty big expectation that it was going to be repeated. The latest output from our local media is that this is unlikely to happen, but never say never. The date on the card doesn't expire until October of next year, 2022. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not the government decides to actually play more money out into people. into people's pockets, and perhaps target it more at the hospitality industry. So how can we manifest a new UBI reality? I put up a poll at the beginning of this presentation, and I asked some questions about how people feel that UBI might become a reality, or nations might accept it. My view is, if we align to the expectations of citizens, because I think a large part of this is going to be public pressure. Of course, it's not going to be one single factor that drives it, but I think the more people that get talking about it, the more people that understand the benefits and understand how it works, the better it's going to be, and the more likelihood that, you know, little initiatives like the £100 spend local card become scaled up as people see the benefits of doing so. One of the biggest questions, of course, that I get asked about this, I did an interview on our local BBC radio station, and of course one of the first questions is, you know, how do we fund this? You know, what's the short-term way of funding it? What's the longer-term way of funding it? And I think what we need to do, of course, is look at a minimum income standard. And lots of people would say we need to go way beyond that. You know, I think we need to get there in steps. Is it realistic to go from, certainly in Jersey, where we are now, to a full universal basic income? I think that's quite a quantum leap. I think the more realistic view is to undertake a minimum income standard, see what's achievable. My view is, if it was a sum of money that was agreed on, then that should be time bound each month in the same way as the spend local cards were. And actually what that would do is make sure that the monies are continually pumped back into the economy. What of course we would need to avoid, you know, considering the environment, is that people don't end up spending money on frivolous things or on things that actually are just consuming even more from the planet. So there has to be a balance there, in my view. But I think that what we've got is a great opportunity to look at how it would be funded and look at the savings from a universal basic income as opposed to an income support scheme as we have in Jersey, and the army of civil servants that is needed to run that scheme. I think if you did a cost benefit analysis on every pound that was paid out in benefit, what it actually costs to administer that pound, you know, that research hasn't been done, and I think that would be a really interesting statistic to actually draw out and use as part of the cost savings for a universal basic income. Promoting it constantly. I speak to media outlets quite a lot. I'm quite big on social media, as I see lots of people are here, and I see some great things on social media and some great things in the wider media, and they're really marketed well. I like the Fly UBI little snips that I've seen. They're really clever. I think they're really innovative, and they catch people's imagination. And you know, channeling the power of our ability to deliberately create is a big part of doing this. I think the more we talk about it, the more we see it and accept it, and just know that it will come about. It will be a reality. It will be everyone's reality, because it's great that, you know, people like Elon Musk and others are talking about it and see it as an inevitability. I think not everyone can relate to high profile figures like that, who some people would say, you know, what has UBI got to do with multi-billionaires? Actually, it's got everything to do with multi-billionaires, in the same way as it's got everything to do with people who are on the breadline. So let's keep talking about it. Let's keep this conversation going in a positive way. I think all the things that I've seen on the WOVA website have been fantastic. The positive conversations that people are having, even when they're not fundamentally agreeing on the principles or on the way forward, it's still really respectful and it's still really positive. So long may we keep that going. So when I'm on social media, as well as write about UBI and as well as write about my work and sort of observations on society, I also do short poems. I specialize in 4-line rhyming stanzas. And when I posted this little poem and someone read it and said, actually, it works really well with Will I Am, Where Is the Love? So I'll read it out to you, and perhaps you can read it a couple of times. And once you get that tune in your head, then perhaps you can see where it's going. So it's pennies tossed in open hand, scant reward for toil on land. robots taking place of labour, a basic income is our saviour. Get that tune of Where is the Love by will.i.am, and that will make more sense to you. So I'd like to follow this up by questions, and I'll be taking those as I close this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.